back in 2016 before the election that we were going to come back to Iowa, raise a family here. I knew at that point in time that what I wanted to do was join my dad on the farm. So did that. Been farming with him for 2 years with my dad and a cousin. After Lucy was born, we talked it over and decided to run for Secretary of Agriculture, because what I think is really important in Iowa is protecting those small town institutions of schools and churches and local coffee shops and diners, those places where we gather with our friends and family and neighbors. But when you look at the statistics, 71 of our 99 counties have lost population between 2010 and 2016. We cannot be the great state that we've always been if we keep losing people from rural Iowa. And so I don't want to see us become a state where the only opportunities that people believe exist are in the rural or in the urban areas. We've got to make sure that we keep rural Iowa vibrant and strong, and that starts with agriculture. Thinking back to the 1980s when my dad owned that John Deere store, I learned pretty quickly that if farmers didn't have money to buy equipment, my dad wasn't selling equipment. I saw a lot of equipment dealers go out of business. But I also learned that same pain is known by every small business that depends on farmers doing well. And in a state like Iowa, where so much of our manufacturing is dependent on the agriculture economy being strong, that meant back in the 1980s, we had thousands of people laid off the job from Case and John Deere. And we cannot afford that same kind of triple whammy for our economy these days. So we need to strengthen the rural economy. And so that starts with agriculture. And that starts, I think, with making sure the federal government isn't holding prices down like they have the last year and a half. When you think about what they've done with biofuels, they have refused to clear higher blends of ethanol year-round, like E15, and they have destroyed demand for 2.25 billion gallons of ethanol and biofuels by giving waivers to oil refineries that are making millions and millions of dollars. They have pursued a trade policy that, well, to back up one step, when I got into this race back in February, shortly after that, USDA came out with their farm income forecast, and it said that for the 5th time in the last 6 years, we were going to see lower farm income due to bad prices. Since that point in time, when all the tariffs and trade stuff has started happening, we have seen the prices for corn, beans, pork, dairy, you name it. If we grow it and raise it here in Iowa, we've seen those prices go down. And that cannot happen if we're going to keep rural Iowa vibrant. We have kind of I would say, an incoherent and poorly thought out trade war happening right now. China is a bad actor when it comes to international commerce. There's no doubt about that, especially on the topic of intellectual property and the way they make our companies do business to access their market. There's a lot we should do, but rather than getting like-minded countries who have businesses like ours that think that way and rallying our allies, our traditional allies of Europe, Canada, Mexico, Japan, instead of rallying those folks to help us, we've gone out and picked fights with all of them at the same time. And what that has done, it has hurt our market access for corn and beans and pork all around this world. Iowa farmers and a lot of other folks spent a lot of time over the last 20, 30 years opening markets around the world. Mexico for pork and corn, China for pork and soybeans. We have spent the time and put in the effort to open these markets to help boost our farm income. And when we lose that market, we may not get it back. I've talked to folks who've said, I know pork processors in Mexico, they used to buy 2 train loads of pork from the United States every month, and they've just, in the last month, processed their first load of Brazilian pork. You go back to last year, even before the tariffs started, and there were folks in Mexico who were sourcing corn from South America because they just wanted to make sure they were going to have that source that they always needed. And when you look at what's happening in China, I worked for 8 years at the USDA, spent a lot of time listening to crop reports and conditions for not just the United States, but folks around the world. I did not know that Russia was a big supplier of soybeans until the announcement came out a month or so ago that Russia was going to buy a record number of soybeans, or China was going to buy a record number of soybeans from Russia. So we have got to send a message, I think, that the biofuels policy and the trade policy that we have seen is not working for rural Iowa. And some of our elected leaders, including Governor Reynolds and Mike Naig, have told us they've got a great relationship, open lines of communication with folks in Washington, D.C. Well, no one's listening to their messages, so let's send them one from Iowa. Now, a few weeks ago, President Trump was here in Iowa, and he said he was going to make our farmers great again. As someone who farms, I find that highly insulting. Our farmers are great. The prices our farmers are looking at are not so great. But we didn't give away waivers to the oil refiners. We did not pick a trade war that's probably not the smartest thing we've ever done, that's driven down prices for the last 2 months. So we shouldn't have to bear the brunt and be the focal point for a trade war and lower farm income and lower prices that we didn't sign up for. From the UAW members who make our John Deere tractors in Iowa, to the scientists and researchers who are figuring out the next soybeans and corn seed that we're going to use, to the conservation folks who are helping us protect our soil and water, to the folks working the processing lines, turning our pork into bacon and hams, to the folks like my family putting seeds in the ground every spring, taking a chance. Agriculture in Iowa helps feed the world and helps provide a clean source of fuel. And if that's not great, I don't know what is. So to think that none of our elected officials have corrected the president on that point, I find highly, highly suspect. I will stand up for Iowans over party every day. Now, we've got to send a message that the trade and biofuels policy has been bad, and if we can send that message and get E15 year round and get the 2.25 billion gallons of demand for ethanol reallocated, that's going to help us with prices for corn and beans pretty quickly. And if we can get them to understand that the trade situation could have dire impacts for not just our farmers, but you talk to some bankers and they're nervous about what's going to happen because of trade. They're nervous about some people who may not be able to make it to next year. But you talk to those folks who work on the line at Deere, and they're nervous. They don't want to see the 80s again. You talk to the folks who represent the UFCW members who work in so many of our pork processing plants, and they're nervous. We've built a whole bunch of new capacity in pork processing based on the idea that we were going to continue to build our export market overseas. And now that export market is drying up, or it's a little bit questionable. And so we could have a whole bunch more capacity and not as much work for folks to do, and that's another slam to our Iowa economy. So we've got to fix biofuels, we've got to fix trade, but we've also got to think longer term. We've got to figure out what we can do with what we grow, what we do so well, raising corn and beans, and maybe other crops in the future. But we've got to figure out what we can do to add value. If we want young people to be excited about living in Iowa and living in rural Iowa, they've got to know that whether it's to go home to the farm or just to go home, there's going to be a job there that's going to be based on what we do so well in agriculture. And so while I am a very proud graduate of the University of Iowa, I am going to be calling in this campaign for expanding our research dollars, state research dollars at Iowa State University, because we've got to help farmers save money on the front end, but we've also got to figure out what can we do with what we grow and raise that can be commercialized and turned into industry all around the state. The biofuels industry gives us kind of a blueprint for doing this, and farmers were a lot of the folks who helped lead the charge on building that industry, building up 40-some ethanol plants and a dozen biodiesel plants around this state. And so we've got to unleash that same creativity through the use of research so that we can continue to make farming profitable. Because if we can't make farming profitable for young people, it's going to be hard to convince them to stay or to come back. And when you think about what college costs these days, it can be hard to say, hey, you're going to have to borrow some money for college, and then when you move home to farm with your family, you're probably going to have to borrow a whole bunch more money. So we've got to figure out how we make that farming profitable for everyone. Now, I think we have a generational opportunity facing us right now. We have been a great agricultural state because we were fortunate to settle some of the best soil in the world. But we will only continue to be an agricultural state as long as we protect that precious resource. Some of the Iowa State researchers and some of the folks who work at the Ag Research Service at USDA say that some places in Iowa will be without that topsoil that has made us so productive in 40 to 50 years. So that, God willing, could be in my lifetime. And I don't think any Iowan, rural or urban, wants to think about Iowa losing that precious resource and becoming a state that's not an agricultural power. So I think it's incumbent upon us, rural and urban, everyone, to work together. And the way I think that we can do that, one of the ways we can do that, the state's going to have to spend a little bit more money. 8 years ago, voters in Iowa approved 3/8 cent sales tax to go into water and land conservation. And if the legislature and the governor would approve that, we could unleash, I think, a really dynamic set of funding sources, that state money that would come from the sales tax, leveraging more federal conservation dollars, continuing the private investment that farmers are doing in conservation all across this state, and then attracting even more private industry to the table. You talk to any company out there, and they're looking to figure out how they can make their supply chains more sustainable. Whether it's Google, Walmart, on down to folks who are much more connected to agriculture, like Cargill, Pepsi, Coke. They're all trying to figure out how do we make our supply chains more sustainable. It's going to be good for our bottom line. It's also going to be a good story. And so we can unleash, I think, a very dynamic effort in protecting our soil and water if we have that state funding from the 3/8 cent sales tax, leveraging more federal money, continuing investment from private farmers, landowners, and then that private industry that it's going to be attracted. And I think when we start doing that, we're going to start building soil health out on the land. We're going to make ourselves more resilient to the crazy weather situations we see. Our farm out in Jasper County on a Monday got 4.5 inches of rain, and then Saturday got 4.75. And we're seeing that more and more across the state, where really crazy precipitation events over a short period of time are causing problems. And if we're not taking care of our soil, those kind of precipitation events just take the soil away instead of letting it infiltrate. So we've got to do more on the land. And that is going to provide a couple of other benefits. We start increasing the habitat and keeping the water cleaner. That's going to mean more folks are coming to Iowa to hunt. More folks are going to be in rural Iowa fishing. And that's a whole nother layer to the rural economy that's important. I'll never forget, Secretary Vilsack and I were on Sioux Falls, South Dakota in the airport on opening weekend of pheasant season once. And it was jammed with hunters. And as Iowans, all we could see were the dollars not being spent across our great state. And so we need to get back to where we have those great opportunities for folks in hunting and fishing. And that is going to be a whole nother layer to the economy in rural Iowa that is important. Now, I think that my experience growing up around agriculture, farming with my dad, cousin on a Century farm now, the 8 years I spent at USDA, give me the background to do this job really well. I want to go to work for rural Iowans and farmers and folks in agriculture every single day, because I really do think that we're only going to be a great state as we possibly can be as long as agriculture is doing well. We are an agricultural state, and we got to be doing well out there in rural Iowa. So we got to fix some federal. We got to send a message to DC that we need to fix some federal policy to protect our economy. We've got to invest in the research that's going to let us continue to make farming profitable well into the future. We've got to take care of our soil and water. And I want to do all this stuff for Iowans. I want to do it for you guys. So please please help me out in November and let me know, let folks know what we're trying to do. Thanks very much.